Watching UK television or listening to the radio or looking at British newspapers can leave one in no doubt that the UK public is very interested in food and presumably interested in the farming and the imports that support their purchases. So to explore what the possibilities, what some of the problems and prospects are for British food and for British agriculture, I'm talking today to Phil Bicknell, who is the head of food and farming at the National Farmers Union. And we're going to explore from his perspective, that of the farmers predominantly, some of these issues that we can identify as being interesting. So let me start in a fairly general sort of way and say, what major food producing problems, supply problems, do you perceive in the reasonable future, both perhaps from the domestic production point of view and from the question of imports?
I suppose here we are at the end of approaching the end of 2015. The big coverage of the farming industry through the summer, through the course of this year, has been about low prices and low returns to farmers. I think there's no doubt when I go around the country and speak to our members, their big concerns are about low prices, the impact that has on their profitability and the impact that has on cash flow. I think longer term, you start looking again, it's about the financial aspect. Where are we going to get the money from for the long-term investment? Personally, I think we've got a major challenge with regard to infrastructure. The other areas, the big areas that I start to think about are about skills and labour availability, not just in terms of new entrants into farming, but also in terms of the workforce. I suppose the other area that starts to come in is our ability to respond to some of the market challenges that are out there. We're seeing much more volatile times for farmers, not just in terms of the financial aspects of global commodity markets, but we're also seeing an increasing frequency of climatic events that have hit global agriculture in certain parts of the world over the last 4 or 5 years.
Well, we can gradually explore some of those things. Farming is, of course, a slow activity to respond, isn't it? Because you make plans and then the weather changes, or you have other external factors, and it takes you a long time to respond, like months or maybe even years. But when you talked about infrastructure, what had you in mind about development of infrastructure in this country?
I think the specific thing that jumps to mind is around water. We know that coming ahead there will be challenges around water.
Insufficient water in the right places.
Insufficient, maybe too much in some places. Yeah. Being able to build reservoirs. Last time I crunched the numbers for reservoirs, at the moment investing in that sort of thing is pretty marginal. I think there's a challenge that we've got in our livestock sector. We would have had in the past a tax system that helped through a farm buildings allowance. That's no longer available. One of the things that concerns me is just some of the low levels of investment that we do see in livestock farms in terms of new buildings. And when you get new buildings, when you get anything new, it can change the way you do things on farm.
How about machinery? Are farmers investing in up-to-date machinery?
Yeah, I think with I suppose compared to now we're talking about low prices. The last 4 or 5 years we've seen relatively strong prices. We've seen some positive returns, positive figures for some sectors. What you saw coincide with that was farmers spend more money on machinery and invest particularly on plant and machinery. I suppose part of that is because it's relatively easier to do. You're investing tens of thousands, whereas putting up a new dairy unit, you're talking hundreds of thousands. Yeah. So I think we've set, and you start looking actually at some sectors, whether it's satellite navigation and controlled steering on tractors, whether it's satellite mapping of yields, some great advances in technology. If you'd have told me 20 years ago we'd see robots in the milking parlour, I'm not sure I'd have believed you, but we're seeing increasing numbers of dairy farms that have invested in robots. That frees up the farmer to better manage the business because he's not milking. It's a cost saving in the long run. It also gives him much more data, much better data about how the business is doing.
While I think of it, people often talk about this being an era of cheap food. And I know that prices fluctuate from year to year and so on, but what do you feel about, is it really an era of cheap food compared with when, and how do you feel it's likely to continue?
I suppose what we've seen recently is the falls that we've seen in farm gate prices be reflected in falls to the shopper in terms of their basket. As shoppers, we are still spending fallen again. We're spending just over 9% of our wages on food.
Yeah.
That's a pretty small proportion now compared to where we were in the mid-60s, where it would have been about a third of our income.
So it's gone down from a third, you reckon, to 9%?
It's gone down pretty significantly. We saw a slight bump 2 or 3 years ago when commodity prices were in a much different place to where they are today, but we're back down to it being kind of low 9%.
So when people talk about cheap food, is it perhaps more accurate to talk about it as being cheap in terms of proportion of disposable income rather than the actual prices, because the prices of course go up with inflation and all the other factors?
Yeah, I think it's both, but we're in a period where we've seen food deflation for a number of months.
Yes.
Now, I suppose what I'm primarily concerned about is farmers and the farm gate price, make sure that they get a fair price and a price that is sustainable. We've seen obviously the growth of discounters, the Aldis and the Lidls come in, gain market share, and we're seeing a renewed round of price competition at the retail end. Now, some of that depends on the margins that are taken between the farm gate and the retailer end, but certainly it makes for those negotiations between farmers, between our members and retailers around price really tough right now.
Right. Now, we in this country produce something like 60% of all the food that we eat, so that means we import 40%.
Yeah.
What are the prospects, problems that you can foresee in the import market?
I think some of it is, in the long run, is about increased competition
from other customers.
Yeah. And part of the situation more recently around their prices has been because Russia have banned the import of certain foodstuffs. The Chinese economy has slowed down, but the long-term forecasts over population growth aren't going away. That means that we'll face increasing competition for our food. As incomes increase, as dietary change, then some countries will be more willing to pay more for their food. I think you start to see some trading blocks developing longer-term relationships. So whether that's Chinese businesses going and investing in Africa or investing in Australasia, looking at how they secure their long-term food. I think in the long run, the idea of being able to go out onto the world market and buy things at the drop of a hat, much more challenging.
Do you think that although the trading relationships may well vary in the way you describe, do you think the global production of food will more or less keep up both with the population and with the desire of people to eat better in many places than they are now?
Yeah, I suppose if you look back at various points in history, there's always been concerns about population growth being outpacing the ability for us to supply food. But generally speaking, I think agriculture kicks on, agriculture produces, and broadly speaking, we see production increase globally.
Yeah.
And we've got quite a lot of potential, I think. We've just seen the UK regain the record-breaking levels for wheat production.
Yeah.
If we can start to, if that record-breaking level becomes attainable much more widely across the UK, that's a step change.
And do you feel that the UK agriculture, in terms of its development and its sophistication, is up there in the front of agricultural development?
I suppose in terms of yields, we're leading the way. Our wheat producers will be amongst the highest in the world. As much as the dairy farmers are struggling right now in terms of profitability, the average yield again is at the forefront of some of the highest in the world. I think the challenge that we have had is in the last couple of decades we saw the investment in the agricultural R&D decline pretty significantly, and some of the perhaps the plateauing that we've seen in some sectors is I think we can attribute to that. So trying to turn on that R&D pipeline again is something that we've been pretty concerned about as the NFU. We are seeing more investment in some areas now, but it takes time for that to be taken up by farmers. There's a big issue there around the knowledge exchange, how information gets from the research end to the practical end, and sees uptake and sees impact in the field. So
we could, in principle, at any rate, be making better use of technology, the latest technology as it develops.
Yeah, I think so. I think some of the technology makes undoubted sense. So if you start thinking about precision farming, yield mapping, if you can understand where the most productive parts are in your field, then you can target your application of fertiliser to those areas. Now that's good news from a business viewpoint because you're using what is a pretty expensive input in the right places. It's also good news from an environmental footprint because you are optimising, making best use of where that fertiliser goes.
Sure. Okay, now in terms of technological developments, there are a few categories that one might look at, but let's start with crops and livestock improvement and the changes that might occur there. There's ongoing development in terms of breeding stock of all of both the plants and animals. What developments do you see in the British context in the immediate years, 5, 10 years, something like that?
I suppose when we start looking at the kind of medium term, much of it is probably down to management rather than seeing wholesale changes in breeds. I think the scope to make better use of measuring things like daily live weight gain, understanding which are the most productive animals on a farm, you then reflect that in your breeding traits. I suppose some of that then goes contrary to where maybe the directions that have been given to us from agricultural policy. Particularly in the livestock sector, it's been towards more extensive production. What we're talking about is trying to increase productivity again. From a crops perspective, again, I think precision farming is perhaps the one big area there. If you'd have told me 20 years ago when I was at university, you were talking about tractors that were guided by satellite, where auto steering happened and somebody sat in a cab and let the computer do the work and do the farming, I've been really surprised about that.
I guess many people actually don't know very much about precision farming. Can you enlarge a little more? Just what can you do with it? When you say people sitting in a cab and, as it were, reading the newspaper, what actually is it like?
I suppose it's just as we used to probably see satellite navigation in our cars that guide us where to go. This is actually going kind of one step beyond about mapping where the tractor goes, knowing the size of the field, automated steering that will turn you around on a
But with what degree of precision? How closely do you know the position of a tractor?
Closer than I'd be able to do it if I was driving.
Oh, really?
It. Yeah, and I think that's one of the savings where you start, if you're going up and down a field, whether it's planting a crop, whether it's supplying fertiliser, you will inevitably have a degree of overlap. Now, what precision farming does is lets you minimise that degree of overlap, so it reduces the number of times you have to drive the tractor up and down the field, makes smarter use.
And does it direct the position of spray nozzles?
Yeah, it will go as far as that as well. So, and I think some of that is probably again the thing that we look at in the medium term, just smarter use of how we're applying everything. Yes. And it's not just, I suppose, it's not just in the field, but in the pack house as well. So when you're seeing fresh produce on supermarket shelves, chances are that will have been packed in a pretty sophisticated way. I was on an asparagus farm earlier in the year, and every piece of asparagus was photographed 10 times to identify the right shape, the right quality, make sure that it was put together in the bundle.
That's rather incredible, I have to say. I hadn't thought of people taking umpteen photographs of asparagus. So this sort of technological approach is widespread now in the British farming and food industry?
Probably wouldn't say widespread, but it's on the increase. And I suppose the challenge comes particularly in those sectors where you're seeing low levels of profitability. And I suppose I'm conscious that this year a lot of our cereal producers will have probably lost money. The price of wheat is below what it costs them to produce them. Now, some of the more profitable years, they will have taken the money that they've made and invested in the machinery and the kit that enables them to be smarter businesses and better businesses. But if we're not making money, then that obviously has an impact on investment levels.
But to hark back to something we talked about before, that always happens in farming, doesn't it? Because you can't predict what the next year's yields are going to be.
Well, to some extent, and what we've seen is farming policy shift away from trying to manage the market, and we're seeing a lot more volatility in prices because we're responding to those market dynamics. So the change of common agricultural policy and its focus of just trying to give consistent supply, that's gone. So we're more exposed as farmers to the volatility. Back when, previous job I used to do farm business consultancy, we sit down with farmers, we talk about a sensitivity analysis or what if scenarios of what if your yield was 10% lower, what if your price was 10% or 20% lower? These days we're talking about looking at scenarios where price is 50% lower.
Yes.
We mentioned yields there. I mean, I think that's one of the big advantages actually we've got in the UK. 2012 was a pretty poor year for well, for all farming sectors, but probably the most obvious was in terms of cereal production. We saw the lowest yield we had in more than a decade, but the average yield was still 6.9 tonnes per hectare. Now you compare that to where 2012 we saw drought problems in North America. That meant crop failure in some parts. I remember watching those forecasts for production be successively downgraded. From their initial estimates, the actual harvest of maize, which is the primary feed grain there, it was 100 million tonnes lower than they were anticipating. Now, as much as we were down, where we weren't down by that sort of degree or that proportion.
I'd like to chat, if I may, on new technologies, which there's a lot of debate of various sorts in the country. I don't want to go into this in great detail, but one of the issues is obviously the GM crop issues. What's the NFU view about the future of GM crops in the context of the UK?
I think it's GM has got a potential role to play in terms of that toolkit for the future, particularly when I think we start looking maybe a generation or so ahead at some of the challenges around water and insufficient water. The idea of getting crops that are drought resistant through GM is something that undoubtedly appeals. Some of the challenges right now are around the regulatory process. I think the latest from the European Commission is leaving each member state to take their own approach. I hope that here we have a science-led approach and we recognise that it has got a role to play.
And then there are other arguments about the use of chemical spraying, particularly some forms of insecticide and other forms of pesticide. You have views about those too, presumably?
I think one of the big concerns that we've got as a farming industry, as the NFU, is our access to those tools, because some of those products we're using them to manage disease problems and pest problems. The number of products that are available has diminished pretty significantly. We estimate that we've lost probably about half of the products that were available. So the farmer's toolkit for managing disease, pest and control is diminishing. We've launched a campaign called Healthy Harvest because we want our crops to be healthy, we want our businesses to be profitable, we want to be able to produce food. But if we haven't got the ability to do that with some of those products, then that's a concern. Now that's probably is a little bit different to also the part of the reason that we're not seeing new products come on stream is because in other parts of the world the focus is on GM and on seed traits and developments there, rather than in some of the pest control products.
But people, I noticed somebody said recently that Europe has in fact opted rather for the chemical approach to control, whereas some of the GM advocates are looking at a biological control. Okay, so let's think about the next thing about the sizes of farms, because clearly in this country we have some relatively large farms and still a number of pretty small farms. What do you feel about the future developments in those directions? But not only in arable farming, there's also market farming and fishing, if you like, and forestry, the other agricultural activities.
I suppose it's, as an economist, which is my background, you look at trends in agriculture and we see consolidation over time. We've seen farm sizes in the UK edge upwards. Now, whenever I look at average farm size in the UK versus other parts of Europe, there's a big tends to be a big gap. We tend to have relatively larger farms. Now, part of that is down to the system of inheritance, whereas typically, or historically in the UK, the business will have been passed on to the eldest son in the family. In parts of Europe, the farm will have been fragmented and spoken up amongst all the children. So there's inheritance issues that I suppose have shaped the structure of agriculture. But
does it still do so?
Yeah, no. I think where we start to see, certainly in most parts of Europe, that trend in farm size is heading upwards. Regardless of the farm size in the UK, we are an industry that is still dominated by family farming businesses. Over 95% of our farms are either sole traders or are family partnerships. So it's not as if we're dominated by large multinational, big agri giants.
That's very interesting, because that's really not the impression one often gets from the public media. The impression is that it's all big factory farming and by a big corporation, but it's not. You say it's 90-95% still family.
Yeah, and the family farm might be pretty sizable. It might be farming hundreds and hundreds, possibly even thousands of acres, but chances are it's still a family business at the heart of it.
Yes. Okay, moving on to the next thing then, prospects for livestock in the UK, because presumably much of the UK livestock industry is dependent on imported feedstuffs for overwintering nutrition. How dependent are we on that?
I suppose we're relatively dependent on in sectors like pigs and poultry, where you're talking about relatively high protein feed to make sure that you're producing a product, an animal that the market wants.
And is that imported largely?
Yeah, a significant portion of that of protein will be imported. I think that's an area that needs to be looked at actually by Europe as a whole.
Yes.
Of what's the ability for the EU for Europe, if not individual countries, to be able to supply more of their own protein. Some of it comes down to cost, however. The fact is, if you can get that crop imported cheaper than it can be produced elsewhere, well, that's then reflected in the end price.
And presumably that's a real factor, because big exporting countries, Argentina and the US and Brazil, presumably can by and large produce stuff more cheaply than we can in Europe.
Indeed, and if you're particularly thinking about soya, a crop we can't really grow here, we haven't got the climate for it. That's a major source of protein. Yeah.
But within that context, do you see a healthy future for the UK livestock industry?
I think we've seen continued expansion in our poultry production and our poultry output. I think pigs is a much smaller sector than it was 20 years ago.
Yes.
Regulatory change was I think was behind that, because we introduced a stall and tether ban in the UK 14 years ahead of our European counterparts. All we did was export our pig industry to other parts of Europe. We kept on eating bacon and pork, but because the welfare standards were introduced here, that meant higher costs. That impacted our ability. I think elsewhere we start looking at dairy, we're looking at the red meat sector. I think what we tend to see there is farm businesses that hopefully make the most of their homegrown feed, particularly if you look at the number of dairy farmers that have got maize, which will feature as part of the ration. Chances are that's homegrown. So that's hopefully substituting some of the feed that we used to buy in, some of the high protein stuff.
So you're reasonably buoyant with the prospect for the livestock sector in the UK?
The concern that I've probably got is around our profitability and our viability in the long run. We've got competition on our doorstep from Ireland, but more widely competition from other parts of the world, potentially. I think we've got, no matter which sector you look at, I think we've got some of the best farmers in the world here that can compete when they go like for like, toe-to-toe against some of our European counterparts. But some of the issues in the red meat sector mean that those guys are reliant on common agricultural policy and support payments from that, which are higher in other parts of Europe than they are for us in England.
A British source of origin on meat, though, is highly regarded in this country, isn't it?
Yeah,
so that's one advantage for British farmers.
Yeah, indeed, and it does attract a premium if you look at where prices are versus other parts of the world. A big part of what we do at the NFU as well is trying to champion British farming.
Yeah.
So campaigns, whether it's dairy, whether it's meat, whether it's it's about backing British farming, and some of our retailers do some really good things. So as much as Aldi and Lidl might focus be on price, if you walk into one of those stores, you will see British meat being displayed. They will have the red tractor, which is a widely available assurance standard that will be displayed prominently. I think both of them source 100% of their beef from the UK.
Okay, can we get a bit speculative now? Supposing the climate change people are right, suppose the climate really is in for a protracted change in the temperatures will rise, in other words, the farming and other implications. I'm assuming they talk about maybe 2 degrees centigrade by the end of the century. How's that going to affect British farming? I mean, we talk about that the wine production will move from France to England. Good, but that's only a small part of it. There's a lot more besides that.
Yeah, I think I've got 1 or 2 colleagues that are keen to be the NFU's viticulture expert in the not too distant future. Yeah, I think some of those areas start to come down to what does that mean? We talk about livestock. What does that mean for livestock in terms of heat stress, particularly for our sheep and our beef sector, which will typically be outdoors and grass fed. What does that mean for some of our vegetable production? Some of the forecasts I see talk about the potential change. It could be beneficial for us. Mm-hmm. So if you start thinking actually about some of the dairy farms that we've got in the southwest or in West Wales, why are they there? Because the grass growth tends to be, it's not year round, but it's not far off it.
Because the climate's more amenable for it. Yeah.
So if you start seeing some of that, does that start to benefit farming in some sectors with extending seasons, extending output? The big challenge I think starts to come in terms of water and water availability, yes, particularly for our field scale veg. Yes. It's also might impact on some of our broadacre crops as well.
But there will also be implications if climate change continues in this sort of way on imported foods, because presumably this will have some areas will be affected much more markedly than the UK in terms of the temperature consequences. Difficult, I suppose, to forecast quite what might happen.
I suppose it's difficult to forecast what might happen and when, but we know what the consequences are when it does happen. So in 2012 we saw that drought in North America, and that impacted on availability of grains globally. Yeah. That sent prices rocketing. Yeah. In 2011 we saw drought in New Zealand. They've struggled with the dry spell more recently. Yeah. That means that they've reduced their sheep numbers. They killed more lambs, exported more lambs onto the global market. That dragged prices down initially, but prices then went up because in subsequent years we saw lower levels of lamb output out of New Zealand because they just haven't got breeding for it.
In global terms, say, continuing to suppose that it is going to happen and so on, do you see the possibility in the northern hemisphere of agriculture bodily moving further north as the northernmost climates become warmer and the southernmost too warm?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a climate change expert, but speaking to colleagues who focus on this area at the NFU, I think that's exactly where it looks at the zones around the equator. So I have to question some of the production capabilities there in the long run, and what is the scope as we in the northern hemisphere. So as I say, some of the work I see tends to make me think that we could be in a positive place. Yeah. As long as we can adapt to those changes that are coming.
Which will have the consequences of changes in trade routes and trading relationships, and also causing population pressures, because populations might become impoverished if they can't. Southern populations become impoverished, more impoverished than they are now if they can't produce enough. Okay, fine. Another speculation: how do you perceive the food tastes of the population may be changing? Have changed, may be changing.
It's crystal ball time, I guess.
Why not? You're here. Let's see what's in your crystal ball.
Yeah, I'm not sure the NFU's is any more accurate than anyone else's. I suppose we've seen tastes. Well, what have we seen in the last 2 to 3 decades? We've seen a continued focus on actually price concern. We spoke about that earlier. I think price, no matter which group of shoppers you talk to, price still features pretty heavily in why they buy. Probably the other kind of mega trend that we talk about is convenience as well. Perhaps allied to some of that is we see a break with people understanding where the food comes from and how it's produced.
Yeah, so that's quite serious now.
Yeah, it's concerning for me, and I think that's particular with particularly the case with kind of a younger demographic, and where we do see greater interest in food provenance, where it comes from, tends to be amongst older shoppers, tends to be amongst more affluent folks. However, that said, all the retailers are probably trying to flag up displays of farmers in store. Some of the merchandising around products tends to be pretty frequent. In terms of how that then plays out for UK farming, well, I think part of it is making sure that we respond to consumer trends as they change. We can't take the domestic market as a given. We maybe have to change how we produce stuff. And one of the things around lamb, and we're the largest sheep meat producer in Europe. But the one big concern that I suppose I've got looking 20, 30 years down the line is that consumption has been falling. It tends to be an older demographic that prefers lamb. We're not getting that new product development that gets it into younger families or younger consumers. So I think there's a challenge there for not just farmers but meat supply chain and retailers to say, right, how do we try and reinvigorate this market domestically, or where do we look in a global perspective of where people do eat lamb and where we can take advantage of those trends.
I notice as a consumer that people's food tastes, at least as expressed in the number of restaurants of different varieties, has changed enormously in the last several decades. So that where once upon a time you saw a very limited range of food on sale in restaurants, now you get enormous variety. Does that impact on British farming? Is that an import phenomenon in trade terms?
The big concern, I suppose, that I've got when we start talking about restaurants and the wider food service sector is very rarely on a menu will you see labelling of where your food comes from in your country of origin. So you might be a shopper who's really concerned, really diligent when you go in the supermarket, look out for country of origin, look out for the Union Jack or the Red Tractor logo. You just don't have that option, or you probably don't think about it so much, to be honest, when you go out for a meal. Now, with more and more money being spent on food outside the home, that's a big concern for me. And certainly when I talk to colleagues, we speak to retailers on a regular basis. I think we need to get more inroads into the food service sector.
And incidentally, how conscious are people of food origins, place of origin? Has anybody actually surveyed whether people look at the labels?
I think. Good question. There's kind of different surveys out there with varying results, and you'll see that people spend as little time. Some people will spend as little time as possible, won't even look at the labels. Some people will say that labelling is too confusing to even look at it. You'll have other people that will check once and then assume that it's always British. I mean, I think that we push for clearer labelling because I think some shoppers do look for it in the supermarkets. I think that I'll go to lots of farmer meetings up and down the country. I'll have people shove packaging in my hand and go, this is misleading. Where you've got lamb that says product of New Zealand and the UK, or where you've got cheese that says contains milk from Australia, New Zealand, Europe, Ireland and the UK.
Yes.
I don't think that's really what consumers want.
No, I don't think so. Okay, so if we're talking about consumers and the way they buy things, maybe this is not strictly farming, but nevertheless you're closer to this than I am. How do you see the relationship in retailing, for example, between local stores and large-scale supermarkets? There's been an enormous development of the large supermarket in recent decades, and there are glimmers now that it might be changing. The big chains are producing more local stores, and there is noises in the papers and in public discussion that it may be moving off a bit from large supermarkets. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, so
and does it affect your end of affairs?
Yeah, it does. It does matter because supermarkets tend to be among some of the largest customers of UK farming as a whole.
Yes.
So their fortunes and their success can start to have impacts. I mean, I think it's been well documented that Aldi and Lidl have changed the face of retailing. Their consistent growth, their focus on relatively few product lines has been key to their success. Keeps their overheads low. Compare that to a large-scale Tesco or an Asda or Morrison's, much larger stores, much different proposition.
Yes.
Where will they end up? I think we'll see the retailers try and simplify their business models. They're already starting to do that. And that could impact on farmers because if you've got fewer product lines, then what does that mean? If it means that they also simplify some of their standards as well, or some of their relationships, the way they deal with farmers, then that could be positive too. In terms of then that, I suppose the local aspects, I'm conscious that we've lost tens of thousands of specialty shops, be it butchers, be it greengrocers, Being honest, I probably don't see those returning to that sort of extent. However, where it is about specialty production, where there is the right demographic, then I think there's potential.
Another aspect of retailing is farmers' markets, which
Yeah.
are clearly very popular in some areas and among some people. Do you see those developing further?
I think some of that depends on farmers' willingness and their ability to develop their own products and take them and get involved in the retail format. Conscious it's not for everybody, but in some areas, some farmers, some of our members do it very successfully. I think it's in essence, I suppose it's a diversification away from the core business. Again, do I see it being widespread? Well, not when you've got 80% of our share, or 80% of shoppers spend on food being through the supermarkets.
Yes. So it'll remain a fairly
speciality and niche, but yes. I think it has got potential. And from our own, I grew up on a family farm. Part of what we do is retailing meat not through a farmer's market, but to we've got a customer base locally to us, and we'll supply meat through that.
There's another thing that occurs to me. I have no idea whether there's any information on this, but is the developing practice of online purchasing and home delivery, is that affecting the choice people are making? Because clearly they're less likely to look at labels in detail, I would have thought.
Yeah,
or maybe not.
Yeah, and I suppose that continued growth of online delivery. I think exactly right. People don't look at labels. People don't look at country of origin. The other thing that you don't see online is when seasonal products come in, you perhaps don't see the country of origin change to reflect that. So some retailers will source New Zealand lamb at certain points of the year. You don't see that product then flagged or highlighted when the British season comes online. So that's a big concern for our lamb production. Yeah. So I think the other thing, of course, with online shopping is you might just have the same products in the basket, so you don't always check if there are any changes.
Well, I'd like to finish with just asking your views about the more minor aspects of agriculture. For example, organic production. How do you see that developing? Is it likely to increase in popularity and extent? And we might have a look at what you think of agricultural production in man-made environments. We see newspaper reports of people growing plants underground or in skyscrapers or whatever. So, organic, is organic in for a big future? How do you feel about it?
I suppose I'm conscious. I've been working in the agri-food sector for a couple of decades. We go back to the late 90s. Organic and its growth was forecast to be pretty significant, and you'd had specialty retailers that were forecasting for themselves a bright future. Perhaps that hasn't panned out as they anticipated. Yes, we saw some rapid growth in the late 90s in terms of output, but some of that tailed off. More recently, it's been challenged from a consumer angle as the recession hit and people changed some of their buying habits and some of their behaviours. I think organic's got a role. I think it is a niche. Now, it could remain a sizable niche. But
roughly what proportion of food is organic, would you guess?
Won't
hold you to it.
I'm trying to think what the latest figures are. I mean, the figures I always remember are kind of being around kind of 2-3% of the retail market.
Okay, well, it's roughly that number.
And I'm conscious that from a farming perspective, some have converted from organic back into conventional. Yeah. We've got a real challenge over availability of organic cereals. Yeah. So that then impacts on your ability to source organic. If you're an organic livestock farmer, where do I get any cereals or any feed from if there's a reduced capability?
And the premium for imported non-GM soy is high.
Well, just the premium for anything organic imported as well. So some of anything where you're talking about an identity preserved through that supply chain, then that will come at a premium. So,
okay, and lastly, this question of these unconventional underground and in the skyscrapers, as it were. You probably see the newspaper.
I suppose this does take us into tomorrow's world territory.
Yes,
doesn't it? And I suppose I'm conscious that 20 years ago, if you'd have said you'd have had robots in milking parlours, computers in tractors that were steering for you, I might have scratched my head and gone, no, it won't happen. I suppose in some aspects we've got some of those technologies. So take mushroom production, for instance, always produced indoors, but that's on conveyors, so it's stacked on top of each other. And when the medium is then moved out on a conveyor, when you produce your mushrooms off it, and then restocked, and the process happens again. You start looking at something like strawberries that are grown on tabletop systems, or even tomatoes in some of our greenhouses, where it's much more hydroponic, and the nutrients are delivered through the water solution rather than grown in soil. So some of that capability is, or to some extent, I think, is already happening. Conscious that relates to crops that need pretty significant infrastructure, be it greenhouses, and then you start running into cost of investment. You also start running into planning regulations and planning rules as well. So some challenges there. So I see it maybe for some of the speciality end, more on the fresh produce, probably less so for
not for wheat.
No, for our broadacre crops, and for some of our livestock as well.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, very helpful and very interesting. I'm very grateful for what you have told us, and I think it clarifies, at least in my own mind, a lot of things which I was vaguely aware of and couldn't put my finger on precisely. So thanks very much for your coming on this one.